Well, first of all, let me say that I speak absolutely fluent Spanish. Diego was so keen to be involved that I thought, I'd give him this opportunity. I always loved fantasy as a kid. I read a lot of Dragonlance, of David Eddings, of Tolkien, of course. And I love all those things: wizards, magic swords, barbarians, knights in shining armour, those things you expect in the genre. But I think as I grew up, I started to feel there was perhaps something missing from the fantasy I was reading. A sense of realism maybe, a sense of grit, and I started to read history and see how conflicted real history often is, how ambiguous. And I started to feel that I'd like to read some fantasy in which those things were expressed. And I wasn't able to find that much. Admittedly, I didn't look very hard. But I thought I'd try and write some myself. So that was basically, it was my attempt to import some of those things I felt had been missing in the fantasy I read as a kid, while keeping the things that were great about it. I was never the son-in-law that any mother would want to have. That's the big difference between us. I suppose I had this experience of having a bad back. I don't know if anyone in the audience has ever had a bad back. Probably a few have. And I couldn't really move. I couldn't go to the toilet very easily. Things of this kind. And it's made me feel extremely negative towards the world, even more so than usual. And that experience was quite interesting for me. I started thinking how unpleasant would you become, how dangerous would you become if you were in this kind of pain all the time. And I think it was combined with this sense that sometimes fantasy is a bit lacking in consequences. There are people who are very violent, who have very violent lives in many ways, but there's not often a serious consequence, there's not a price to be paid, either in terms of injury to themselves or in terms of the way their mind is damaged by the things they've had to do. And so I wanted to try and have a fantasy world where people were constantly living with the consequences of their actions, both things they'd done and things that were done to them. And I wanted to, I suppose, look at putting realistic men of violence, if you like. Fantasy's full of violent men, but they're of an odd sort. I suppose I started from the standpoint that if you're very, very good at murdering people with edged weapons, you might not be an otherwise effective contributing member of society under other circumstances. Translate that one. Well, I think power certainly can corrupt, and money is power really. And I think money is interesting as well because money doesn't come into Tolkien fantasy very much. I mean, they never talk about money really in Lord of the Rings. There's no money, there's no economics to speak of really. And I suppose I see history as, economics as being a driving force in history and a driving force in progress. You get a lot of these frozen fantasy worlds that seem frozen in time, and the history of the development of industry and society, and banking and money is a big driver in that. And I suppose banking really is a metaphor for power and a means of exercising power. And in traditional fantasy again, power is kind of a positive thing. You can trust powerful people. Powerful people tend to be on your side. You can listen to what they say. When Gandalf tells you a thing, you can trust him. He's going to do right by you. When he says, Sauron's a bad guy, unless you're an orc, exactly. When he says Sauron's a bad guy, we've got to take this guy down. You can trust Gandalf. But in real life, powerful people aren't necessarily quite so trustworthy as that. When Gandalf tells you we've got to take this guy down, you start thinking, do I need to die to take this guy down? Who is this wizard guy? Who's the guy with the beard? Why do I listen to the guy with the beard? So I wanted to look at a kind of, a Gandalf-style character whose motives might be that little bit more suspect. And can you really take the immortal wizard's word at face value, or should you be taking his word with a pinch of salt, especially if he's also a banker? Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of history, and most of what I read these days is non-fiction, is history, military history particularly, but also all kinds of other things that I might happen upon. And I'm always very interested in the contrast between the way things happened in reality and the way they're often portrayed in fantasy and in genre fiction generally. Particularly with warfare. Warfare is a big central concern with pretty much all epic fantasy. They're all set against a backdrop of warfare and feature soldiers and warriors of various kinds in the central roles. And often they concentrate on the kind of success and excellent plans and bravery and the way that people win. But they don't talk much about chance and failure and mistakes. And it seems to me that reading about history is just as much the story of mistakes and disasters and cock-ups and failures as it is of successes, and that these tiny wrinkles of personality can spread out, have these profound effects in the middle of the battlefield. And so I wanted to reflect, if I could, the sort of things that I learned about history in the way that I wrote. But I think also, in order to make your translation as long and difficult as it possibly can be, I was kind of interested to... I'm much more interested in character and plot than I am in world, if you like. I mean, I like the fact that the fantasy gives you the opportunity to mix up all kinds of different historical influences, and you don't have to be obsessed with exactly what sort of shoes the person might be wearing and make sure they're historically correct. You know, whatever shoes you like. I like that aspect of fantasy, but yeah, I wanted to do something that combined a lot of different areas, time periods, if I possibly could, I think. And things like the Gurkish, like Angland, I wanted to give people touchstones that would give them some idea of what a culture might be like without dumping huge amounts of raw data on them and history. I wanted them to be able to focus on what was going on with the characters and have some vague notion through using similar names and similar ideas what the cultures they come from might be. So to steal things from real life if possible. Yeah. Why make them again when the real world's done them for you already? It's mostly immense talent. Hard work is secondary. I don't know really. I think I suppose I come from the point of view that anyone is sympathetic and understandable if you walk in their shoes, you know. And so if I'm writing a character, I just try and think about what their motivations might be, what their everyday thoughts might be, what their little struggles might be, what hurts, they've got a bad foot, you know, they've got their trousers wearing through, whatever it might be. And I just try and make them human and bring it down to a small scale. And I think if you do that, then in a sense anyone becomes understandable, hopefully, to a degree. Even the most unpleasant people, which many of my characters are. I think many of them aren't people you won't necessarily meet in the street or have a drink with, but you know, hopefully you can more or less understand why they are the way they are. Well, up to a point, I think. Certainly people who are... I remember a quote, I forget where it's from, I think Angels in America, a TV show that HBO did a while ago. And Al Pacino plays a very unpleasant person in this series. He asks, do you want to be nice or do you want to be effective? And I think that's true of maybe many of my characters. They're people who've got jobs to do and they have to do quite unpleasant things in order to get there. And so sometimes it takes someone who's quite unpleasant, quite deficient in one way or another to get things done. Oh yeah, well I'm fascinated by the American Civil War. For some reason. That's always struck me as very interesting because it's where a lot of quite ancient feeling, motivations and rhetoric sort of meets a very modern way of making war. It's almost where the modern world appears, and it's one of the first wars in which you get very big, large armies involved in quite large and long-lasting multi-day battles. So the American Civil War I've always been quite interested in. But any and all. And in a way, I try not to make my stuff feel like it's too much of a given time period. I wouldn't want it to feel too medieval or too Renaissance-y or too modern. I want it to have a sense that it could be now, that it has a universal sense, if you like. And it's, you know, applicable to a modern audience as much as it might be to an ancient one. I don't want things to feel like a faux attempt to be historical, because even if you're pretending that you're writing in a past era, in a way, you can't pretend you're not writing for a modern audience. And I think also, I'm always trying, even if I'm writing very big events, I'm always trying to keep it personal, and to write from a given point of view, even if that point of view is shifting and moving from one person to another. I think the secret to making writing exciting, making writing interesting, making a big action sequence immediately effective for the reader, is that you tie it all back to the individuals and you make it about the personal experience. And in a way, you don't worry too much about the big picture. That needs to be consistent, that needs to be convincing, but much more important is the kind of emotional effect on the individuals you're covering. Ooh. Well, I suppose I wrote a fantasy trilogy with the First Law. That was the thing I'd always wanted to write, my take on that form, if you like. And then needing to write some other books in order to fulfil a contract with a publisher, I started to think of some new ideas, some quicker ideas, and the first of those with Professor Cold was a kind of fantasy gangster story in a way. The second was The Heroes, which is a fantasy war story. And so for the third one, I decided to have a go at a kind of fantasy western. And so in a way, although set in the same world and having some characters in common as the previous books have had, it has a lot of the kind of feel and style and setting that a western would have. No six guns, but similar kind of settings, wind-blown streets, dusty standoffs, cattle, wagons, those sort of things you expect from a western, really, but fused with the kind of fantasy setting that I've created. That's the idea. Well, I think, as with many things, when you start actually writing and deciding to have a go at writing a fantasy series yourself, probably you've got ideas that go back a long time, things you've read and have influenced you and you want to include. So I think you probably almost, without thinking, for me, have tended to be the ones where magic's quite rare and hence quite surprised at the characters within the book when it appears. So, and that's not uncommon. I mean, even something like Lord of the Rings, magic is, the Hobbits would see magic as something quite strange and out of the ordinary. And so with my later books, magic's tended to be something that's come up very, very rarely, and I think that's just my taste. A lot of people do much stronger, heavier magic worlds very successfully. But I think generally you just write to your taste. You see, you almost subconsciously come up with those things you like and include them, or leave them out if you don't like them, generally. There's no formula. It's all in the execution as well, really. I think there's always a lot of different things going on. It does feel like lately that kind of gritty, realistic, more historical, perhaps, fantasy has been in the ascendant. Is this George R.R. Martin guy you may not have heard of? That's all right. But I think there has been stuff like that always. I mean, in the 70s and 80s, when things like Dragonlance and David Eddings were the commercial centre of the genre and things seemed much more shiny and simple in general, there were still people like Jack Vance and Fritz Leiber doing things that were quite grimy and nasty in their own ways. And so I think there was always a complicated situation. And currently there are probably quite a lot of writers very successfully ploughing the same furrow of things that are quite straight ahead, quite obvious, and I'm sure the pendulum will swing back the other way, and you'll have something will come along that is very big, that is very romantic and lyrical, and does something new with that, way of doing things. And there'll always be new tendencies coming up, but then they're very, very hard to predict, aren't they? That's why publishers have trouble making money, because you never know what it's going to be next. That's the fun, I suppose, as well.